We're going to kick off with two extremely accomplished gentlemen, one in the world of finance, entrepreneurialism, an early and often investor in the Valley and then well beyond, Roger McNamee, the co-founder of Elevation Partners. The other who spent more than 20 years actually writing policy in Washington, D.C., working in administration and outside of administrations, creating policy around technology, telecommunications, and other endeavors. Larry Irving. They're both here. They're going to come and sit with me to discuss the impact of technology on society. We've had that theme in the morning. We're going to dig into it now. Join me in welcoming Larry and Roger to the Signal stage. Roger, take a seat. Larry.
Good to see you.
Good to see you. I really should have introduced you as a musician, right? I mean,
well, that's also true.
Yes. We share a love of music and making it, you better than me, I would say. But it's been a year, right? This past, and I'm not talking even about politics here. I'm talking about, it's been a year for the technology industry. And it has collided directly with the interests of society. We talked about that with Ariana earlier, and with Susan. What do we take away from this past 12 months? How do we think about what's happened going forward? What's our lessons learned and insights gained as we try to navigate the future of technology and society?
The most important thing that I've learned in the last year is that we all have a misplaced trust in technology and the people who make it. That we have a default system that has been, it was essentially, there was a 50-year period from 1950 to 2000 where technology lived in a world of constraints and where in doing so, essentially everything it did was miraculous and the good so far outweighed the bad that trust was completely legitimate. And the current generation of technology leaders have exploited that trust to the harm of society, to their economic benefit. And in my mind, the challenge, the greatest single challenge that we face is that at the individual level, technology platforms like Facebook, like YouTube, like Twitter, deliver tremendous convenience, deliver fun and enjoyment. Yet at the societal level, they're doing damage that it's entirely possible that we may never recover from.
Larry, what do you think?
It's, you know my history. I started with the internet when there were 15 million people on the internet. And if you ever heard light touch regulation or self-regulatory models, every memo I sent up from 1993 to 1999 was about that philosophy. And I think it was the right philosophy. Imagine you find two cute little bear cubs, and they're little bitty bear cubs, and you bring them home. Well, at that time, you don't really have to restrain their behavior. When they go up to 500, 800-pound beasts, you have to have a different model for them. And when earlier, when Susan was here, she talked about small villages. Well, imagine you have a village of 1,500 people. You have one set of rules. When it comes to New York City and you've got Times Square and you've got predators and you've got crime and you've got fraudsters and all kinds of other things, you need a different set of rules. And unfortunately, our regulatory models and what we're looking at in Washington and in global capitals hasn't kept up. We've got a regulatory model for a 1,500-person village, and we've got we've got Times Square and we've got dark alleys and we've got every type of crime going on, and no one really wants to address the issue the way we need to. We need to address it frontally.
And the people who started these companies, they are idealistic. They didn't set out to cause the damage to fact, the damage to democracy, the damage to public health that has ensued. But there was a massive failure of imagination. They failed to imagine that people would use their products differently than they intended. They failed to imagine that connecting 2.2 billion people on Facebook or 4 billion people onto Facebook's suite of products would in fact introduce large bear problems into a small bear design.
I think we did. I think we just made a meme. Somewhere there's a Goldilocks.
Well, we're a good team. He and I. You see, we color coordinated.
Purple.
I'm wondering if that Goldilocks might have been Mark Zuckerberg. You, Roger, were a very early investor in Facebook, which I'm sure was an awesome thing to be. You helped, if not were the fundamental reason that Sheryl Sandberg left Google and went to Facebook and really built the model for that business. You were a very early, very important mentor to Mark. But you have become, in the last year, the most vocal critic of Facebook that has the standing that you have. And you're working tirelessly, essentially, to undermine the company, if I may use as strong language as that. But you're just not happy with them.
So I would frame it slightly differently. So success has 1,000 fathers. I played a bit part at Facebook. But I was an insider from 2006 to 2009. I did help keep the company independent. I did help bring Sheryl into it. I then, in 2009, stepped back because the kind of stuff I'm good at was no longer on their problem set, so I just became a cheerleader. And in 2016, I happened to observe a set of things going on that suggested that bad actors were exploiting the design of Facebook and the openness of Facebook to harm innocent people. Some of it was electoral, but some of it was in areas like home finance. Some things were just based on civil liberties. And I went to them in October of 2016 and said, guys, I think there's something really wrong here. I think bad guys are taking advantage of the platform. So I thought they were the victim. I spent 3 months trying to persuade them to just look into it, do the analysis, and if there was a problem, to do what Johnson & Johnson did around Tylenol when a madman poisoned bottles of Tylenol and killed a bunch of people in Chicago. I said, guys, nobody's going to blame you. This was done to you. I spent 3 months. They treated it like a public relations problem, like I was the problem, that if I went public with it, that was going to be an issue. And I then spent 6 months studying the problem to make sure I knew what I was talking about. Because as an analyst, your job is to make good decisions on as little information as possible, right? You have to draw hypotheses that are right on minimal amounts of information. I'd observed a set of things, so I didn't have facts. I just had spider sense, I had a lot of experience, and it turned out, by accident, I was right. And so what happened was I spent a year after that speaking publicly on the hope of bringing enough pressure that they would feel a need to change. And what I was really aiming at was trying to persuade the employees, because we didn't know at the beginning that that Médecins Sans Frontières has said that there are at least 9,000 people who are dead in Myanmar as a direct result of what Facebook has enabled in terms of ethnic cleansing. There are 42,000 people who are missing and presumed dead. So it may be 50,000 people who are dead as a direct consequence of Facebook's behavior in Myanmar. I would have thought that would have moved some of the employees to go, hey, wait a minute. We need to get the truth out here, and we need to behave differently. That's what I thought was going to happen. And here we are a year later, and not one whistleblower, not one person on the inside has a problem with this. And I look at that and I go, well, what about the country we live in? What about democracy? Right? What about, I mean, would you guys feel good if there was poison in your products? If every time I brushed my teeth I was getting poisoned? No, you wouldn't do that. Well, why are these guys doing that?
Well, actually, I mean, do you have a thesis for why? Because, I mean, I have talked to, folks who work there who express very different points of view than what publicly Facebook will say about the...
Well, I'm sure that's true.
Yeah.
I mean, they're human beings. I'm simply saying that the company is still going at 100 miles an hour. They believe this was a public relations problem that is now behind them. And that you saw the stocks at an all-time high. The business is going really, really well. The users, they love the convenience. They have a behavioral addiction to these products, so they're not looking to do anything different, right? I mean, all of you probably feel really good about Facebook. I still use Facebook. I love Facebook as a product, right? The problem here is that there are societal problems that are undermining really basic things like fact, right? I mean, if you look at the damage being done by Facebook and YouTube and Twitter to our sense of what is fact, ask yourself, how does the rule of law survive if there are no facts? How do brands survive in a world where there are no facts? Yeah. They don't. And how do you survive in a world where any old competitor can come along, create a piece of disinformation about Crest or some other product that you have, and people believe it because they don't know what's true anymore? I mean, that's going to happen. It hasn't happened to you yet, but it's happened to people in the film business. And I guarantee within a year or two, it'll be happening to you too.
Yeah. So we talked about the little bear, the big bear. Let's get into the appropriate enclosure for the bear.
Which is an important.
Yeah. So tell me, if you could wave a magic wand and start a policy discussion that was more than the sort of showmanship that I saw in Washington when Mark came and did honestly, the political theater of this week that we saw with Facebook, Twitter, and Google kind of being dragged in front of the Republicans to be yelled at about conservative censorship. What would that policy dialogue be based on? Where would it go? Do you see any solutions?
Solutions are on the horizon, but we have to start the dialogue. And the reality is we haven't even started that in Washington. Most people in Washington, and they're really good, I spent my life around policy, and they're smart people, they're good people, they want to do the right thing by the nation. They don't have the understanding of how this ecosystem works to necessarily get, so we have to start with educating folks as to what really goes on. When a senior senator asked, what's your revenue model, and didn't understand it was ads, that was a hint that maybe we weren't quite where we needed to be. What's happening in Europe with GDPR is a start, but it probably isn't going to port completely to the United States.
Just in case folks aren't sure what GDPR means, my acronym meter is gone. So the General Data Protection Regulation
So the European Union came out with a privacy regime called the GDPR. It became enacted about 2 months ago, and for most of us, we've been affected mostly by having to say, yes, we accept whatever screen fell out on our laptop.
That we haven't read.
We haven't read, and we just said, yes, thank you, and we kept on going. That's not going to port here. We need to rethink privacy policy. People call it a surveillance society. So 2 days ago, I had my 10th face-anniversary with Facebook. And when I signed up for Facebook, I can tell you why I signed up for Facebook. I was getting ready to go to the Democratic Convention. There were all kinds of great Obama commercials and memes running around on Facebook. And friends of mine on Twitter and Facebook said, you're missing it if you're not on Facebook. So 10 years ago, I got on Facebook. And I was pretty happy with Facebook. But I didn't sign up 10 years ago for all of the different things Facebook now knows about me, says about me, and does with that data. And we have to kind of start from a consumer-centric viewpoint. What does the consumer want and expect? We've talked a lot today about brand trust and what does the consumer expect from a brand? I can assure you that Larry Irving of 2008 did not expect that Larry Irving of 2018, when he buys a pair of ASIC sneakers, is then going to see an ad for ASIC sneakers every 30 seconds when I load up Facebook, and then when I go to Google. And then, these are not things we expected. With Twitter, I didn't expect some of the information they have about. When you look at what Facebook, Google, and Twitter know about us without our permission, and now we're locked into these ecosystems. I've got 2,000 to 3,000 friends on Facebook. I don't want to lose them. But can I take my data? Can I take my photos? How do I move those around? Those are the questions we have to ask. And I'm hoping what's going to happen in Washington, and I've got to give Roger a lot of credit, he's teed up the conversation, is we'll have a conversation. Let's not look at the industry, and let's not look at the internecine battles between the ISPs and the edge companies, or the ISP and the content companies. Let's think about what the consumer really wants.
Yeah.
And one example, in 1984, I was a young kid, I had hair, I was running around Capitol Hill, and I helped write the 1984 Cable Act. And we deregulated cable, because cable was being held back by the broadcasting industry. Broadcasters had 3 networks, they had a monopoly, bad things were happening, and they weren't really giving the cable industry free rein to create something that I think has been great for the country. In 1990, the cable industry had started abusing some of that power. They were monopolists. They were raising rates. They were shutting out new providers. They didn't want the satellite industry to get creative and emerge. So in 1992, I was the staffer that helped write the 1992 Cable Act. So in 8 years, we went from cable, you're the greatest thing in the world, we want you out there. 1992, we got to restrain you a little bit. We have to change the paradigm. We're kind of at the same place with the internet. I love the internet. I use it every day. I think it's important for education, for healthcare, for consumer goods. We're a better society in many ways because the internet exists, and 4 billion people have access to it, and 7 billion people have access to mobile phones. That's a fantastic thing. But there's also a downside that people are dying in Myanmar, and that the thing in this country, the biggest problem we've had since de Tocqueville, has been race. And yet Facebook allowed folks to come in and divide us further during a presidential election around the issue of race.
Right.
I mean, Black Lives Matter was something, they were beating people who don't know black folks around the fact that we were some kind of a danger using technology. Well, there's got to be a middle ground somewhere, and that's what the conversation in Washington has to be.
Now, these companies, and we heard this, I would say, look, as you pointed out, Roger, most founders, and certainly the founders of the companies that have grown very, very large, including Richard this morning at JD, are idealistic. What I heard Susan say this morning in a very impassioned way was, I understand. This is our crucial moment. We've got it. We're on it. We are self-governing ourselves. We realize that we need to make new rules. We need to run our platforms as metropolises and not as small villages. We're going to do that. We're in the midst of doing that. What I didn't hear was, and we can't wait for the US Congress to help us do that. And that has been the philosophy of the Valley forever, supported by administrations where you worked, Larry, which is, let's not strangle, the baby cub before, it grows up. Let's let it grow up. And now I think we're hearing another chorus, and Facebook strikes me as another example of this, where they're saying, guys, we acknowledge and admit and apologize that we screwed up, but we got this. We have the smartest people in the world working for us. We're hiring tens of thousands of people to manage this situation. We're spending all this money. Don't worry, we'll self-regulate. What's your response to that?
So Einstein had a famous quote where he said, you cannot expect, this is a paraphrase, you can't expect to solve a problem using the same tools you used to create it in the first place. These guys all believe that there is a code-based, AI-based solution to every problem. Let me give you an example of something where that's not true. Roughly 1 person in 3 in the United States identifies with an issue that is demonstrably not true. That number has risen dramatically because of the impact of what are known as filter bubbles, which is this notion of people giving you what you like to the exclusion of everything else. Facebook is 2.2 billion Truman shows, everybody with their own reality. If you sit there and think through what that means for democracy requires deliberation, it requires respect for differing points of view, and it requires compromise. And these systems are all designed in a way to monopolize attention. And in doing so, the techniques that they've used to do that make compromise impossible because you literally can isolate yourself. There is no technology solution for the 35% of Americans who believe something is demonstrably not true. The only way to fix that is to have them interact with people who represent different points of view. This is part of the role that you all can play, right? Because you sell to everyone. Your interest is in having everyone be part of a conversation together. My observation that these systems are really destructive to brands isn't like 20 years from now. I'm talking about today. I mean, you're really lucky that nobody's gone after any of your brands yet. But if you were the people who did Ghostbusters, the reboot with the women, you've already experienced this problem. There's a company that one of my colleagues is part of called New Knowledge that's literally there to help corporations protect themselves, because everybody's protected against hacking, but nobody's protected against brand assault. Nobody. And if you don't think that's coming, the Russian playbook's available to everybody, right? This election cycle, it's not just going to be foreign countries. It's going to be everybody. In fact, heck, for all I know, you guys will do it because there's somebody who disagrees with something you want to get done. Right? I mean, that's a free-for-all. That's not civilization.
Well, that's sunny.
But my point is, that is what, bear with me a moment. That is what self-regulation has brought us to, okay? We've passed that point. We've been asking them nicely.
Yeah.
I will tell you, if this were the 50s, we would shut them down. I mean, they are a clear and present danger from a security point. I mean, look what just happened in Helsinki. You don't think these guys played a role in that? Of course they did.
Can I make two? I want to pivot on a point you made and go slightly different. Washington really, we were talking in the back, and Washington needs the help of the folks in this room to help us understand how this ecosystem works and where the frailties are. As we're looking at, I've met people the last 2 days that they describe job titles that I had no idea what they did, and I've been involved in media and technology policy for 30 years. And so you're part of an ecosystem, and we need to know what you know, and you've got great people in Washington and in Belgium doing government affairs, but we don't get granular enough to really understand how we can help you protect yourselves and how you can be the best consumer brand you are and not have this online crisis affect your business. But there's a second point, to go back to the first question you asked me. Why did we have this self-regulatory model in Washington? Why did we have this light touch regulation? The United States was not just the technological leader with regard to the internet and broadband and mobile. We were the policy leader. And what's happened is now we have a policy vacuum. And other nation states and other actors are now stepping in. So you're seeing that Europe is saying, we're going to do what we want to do in privacy, and part of what they're doing is to protect consumers, and part of it is to protect their own homegrown industries. China is developing its technological policy. Now, I happen to believe that competition and innovation and private markets work better than centralized control. But if we don't have a policy, and we don't as a nation, and people are seeing our elections are having problems, and people are dying in Myanmar, and there's all kinds of political tension because of this network of the political model we have here. Why wouldn't you accept the Chinese model? No, they're not having those kinds of problems. And so we really have to have a robust discussion as a nation. This is the most important, dynamic, fascinating, lucrative sector of our economy, and we have no idea how we want to regulate it. And we're really not in a position to do what we need from 2019 forward in the same way we did what we needed to do from 1993 to today.
Right. Well, now I want to. There's a lot to unpack here.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that.
No. It's. I'm excited. I'm also concerned because we wish we had more time. But let me try to do it this way. It seems to me that the policy we currently have is capitalism. In other words, it's
a form of capitalism.
Yeah, but it's a form of capitalism. But
it's a very extreme form of capitalism.
When I think about the re-engineering of these companies that I think would make you say, okay, that's the right thing to do. We're talking about putting the consumer in control, having an engaged populace who actually cares about the data that's being used, that actually wants to get out of its filter bubble. This feels like a very tall order, and what's even feels taller is this idea that Google or Facebook or Twitter would have any interest in seeing that world emerge because it would destroy, for at least a period of time, their quarterly earnings.
Well, to be clear, I don't think there is a solution that we can form that leaves things the way they are. So I would like, I've spent my whole life as a capitalist. I would like to see competition in these spaces. So one of the regulatory things I would like to see is portability of all the data to lower the bar for startups to get going. But the thing that I would observe, and I think this is relevant for your world, is that this is an industry where Steve Jobs famously described computers as bicycles for our minds. He noted that, if you looked on transportation, mobility of creatures, humans were about a third of the way down the stack. But if you gave a human a bicycle, it was the most efficient at self-transport of any creature on Earth. And his notion was computers could do that for the mind. The problem with Google, Facebook, is that those two companies believe in artificial intelligence. They believe in replacing the human. Google has an ad campaign, make Google do it. Okay? The problem with that is we are making people dumb. We are taking them out of the equation. We are removing agency. This is actually a process that began in the 50s, because in the 50s we began converting the generation of people who grew up solving the Depression and the Second World War into a generation of consumers, right? And so we stopped being active citizens and we became passive consumers. And we all benefited enormously from that, but the problem is when you get to a situation as we did in 2001 after 9/11, where the President of the United States says the most patriotic thing you can do after 9/11 is to go out and shop. And you say to yourself, well, what's wrong with that? And I go, well, there's nothing wrong with that as long as nobody messes with democracy, as long as nobody messes with public health. But now we have people messing with democracy and public health, and we don't have the muscle tone to respond. And that's the reason I think that the policy thing is so difficult, because, you know, the kids in Parkland in 8th grade, they were required to take civics. They are in a school which requires the arts. I do not think it is a coincidence that they are so articulate, but that is not normal in high schools in America, right? Yeah. You wouldn't normally, you know, most high schools that get shot up don't have kids who are that articulate. Yeah. And my point is, we have to solve that problem, right? We have to solve, what does citizenship mean? What does it mean to be a democracy? What does it mean, what's the capitalism we want? I mean, is it right to have somebody earn $150 billion in 20 years? Is that a policy failure, as Andy Lowry would say, or is that a success story? It's an interesting debate, and one we ought to have.
You know, we need to really think about what's capitalism, what's not capitalism. Teddy Roosevelt was a Republican, and during the Progressive Era, we started looking at trust, and we had a whole new a concept of antitrust that didn't exist, was created in the Gilded Age. My law school professor at Stanford was a guy named Bill Baxter, who was Ronald Reagan's antitrust enforcement officer. I'm a Clinton-Obama Democrat, but the person who broke up AT&T was Bill Baxter, the Reagan Republican. You can be a capitalist, you can be a conservative, you can look at things that are anti-competitive.
And antitrust is actually the most pro-competition form of government intervention. Yeah. I mean, if you look at AT&T, 1956, they get a consent decree in which they're limited to telecoms, so they can't enter computers, and they're forced to license all their patents at no cost. They had the transistor. That consent decree literally created Silicon Valley. And did it harm AT&T? Well, no, because 25 years later, they had to have a second antitrust case and break them up. Did that harm it? No, every one of those pieces went to all-time highs, and we got cellular telephony and data networking at least a decade earlier than we would have. I mean, the obvious first step here is to apply is a pro-competition antitrust policy.
And we have to look at that, and we're not really having that conversation. We're going to have two companies in the United States and probably some in China, maybe trillion-dollar companies in a few years. Right. Good luck competing with that. And you know, I look at the other day, my mom is 88 years old, right? So she has Alexa at home, and the Alexa thing at home, and she talks to Alexa, and I come home and pick up her iPhone, and I go shopping for her. And I'll pick up Charmin, and I'll pick up Tide, and I'll pick up Old Spice for me, right? So I get all these great brands. Well, 2 days ago, I'm looking at my Amazon thing, and they now know what I buy for my mom, and they're telling me all of Amazon's products that they have that they want to get in front of me that are similar to products you sell. This is an interesting conundrum for folks. Like, on the one hand, it's really convenient. We have an 88-year-old.
Interesting is a pretty common.
I'm trying. They're an $800 billion company that knows everything I buy and on what schedule I buy it, not just for me, but for my mother. Right. This is kind of an interesting phenomenon we've never seen before.
So John, this is the simple part of the problem, which is what's known as the Internet of Things. So we're going to take all of these technologies and apply them to devices that sit in your kitchen, listen to you, to your refrigerator, to music devices, to your car. Now, currently there are no rules about what to do with the data, none at all. And in fact, if you have a television that listens to you, say a Chinese one by Oppo, you have no idea what's happening to, who's listening and what they're doing with it. It would seem to me that one cool thing we could do is to have the equivalent of, some kind of ethics rules about how we're going to use Internet of Things around data. We should set limits. We should do the same thing around artificial intelligence. And I would salute my friends at Salesforce for having already started to do that. But let's look at the parts that haven't happened yet and stop them from doing harm before they do harm. Because this stuff is happening right now. Anybody, if you have an Alexa at home, you just need to ask yourself the question of who's listening and what are they doing with it? Because you don't know the answer to either one of those questions.
Let me ask a final one.
I hope this is been so uplifting.
Hang on. My job is to run into rooms with my hair on fire. I hope I'm doing that.
I would, but for obvious reasons I can't.
I'm sacrificing for both of us.
I knew that, and that's why I asked you to come. You mentioned the Gilded Age and the Progressive Age which followed, and I do believe we are in a similar shift. I also have a thesis, which actually Katie Couric brought up this morning, which is that if we want to see faster action, we need to turn to our companies. We need to turn to the most nimble, vehicles of capitalism we have. Procter & Gamble, for example. How can companies become actors in this grand narrative we just described? And what would you suggest they do, as you pointed out, Larry, to not only educate Washington, but to become forces for good so that this narrative turns out better than perhaps many of us are feeling after the last 29 minutes?
I guess I'll start. I've been here all day long, and I'll be honest, I've not just saying because I'm a guest, but I'm saying it because it's real. I've loved hearing what you're doing and how you're doing it, the different stories, the ways you're trying to create content, the stories you're telling, the way you're trying to disintermediate the disintermediators, you're trying to disrupt the environment. I sit on the board of PBS and have for 8 years, and I think what we try to do at PBS is a lot what you're trying to do here at Procter & Gamble. Tell American stories, bring us closer together, have people have an understanding. But have people having an understanding of what's happening in this industry today is really important, but also bringing people together. We can drive 15 minutes from where we are right now and find folks who have a significant opioid problem. We could probably walk 15 minutes and find people who have and we're not really telling those stories. And even on PBS, we were 5 years too late. 60,000 people will die in this country this year, more people than died in all of the Vietnam War from opioid. We don't understand and know each other. To the extent that you're doing that, that's helpful. Getting people to vote, getting particularly millennials and other folks engaged, and getting outside of your comfort zone and working with those communities that you don't know, that you don't understand, that seem foreign to you. By the year 2040, 52% of this nation is going to be black, brown, or Asian. That's going to be your consumer base. It's also going to be employee base. It's also going to be the folks who are driving the next iteration of technology in this country. And yet, you look around this room, it clearly ain't leaning toward 52%.
Well, it's 52% of babies today.
52% of babies today. So the kids, and it's more than half the kids going to kindergarten this year will be children of color. So how do we have those kinds of things? These are all, firstly, your customer, but two, they're the folks that are going to help keep Procter & Gamble a great brand and keep America a great country. And we've got to figure out a way to also, the term digital divide was, that's something I coined, and I'm proud of that, because if we don't make sure that they're part of this technology revolution. And one last statistic. I did a speech in Australia on politics in America, and then I did another speech in Australia on technology in America. And I had 2 different slides, and I'd never looked at them at the same time. And so the night before the 2 speeches, if you look at a slide of who has broadband in America and who doesn't, and if you look at a slide of who voted for Donald Trump in America, it's almost by county 1-to-1. If you have broadband, if you're part of this new information economy, you didn't vote for Trump. If you didn't have access to this, if you're not part of the new economy, you did vote for Trump. Now, I don't know what that means, but it means something. Mm-hmm. And we need to figure out what that means and how we change that, because we can't have the 2 Americas that John just talked about 2 decades ago. It's even worse today than it was then. We don't know each other, we don't like each other, we don't understand each other. And a brand that's as global as Procter & Gamble can do a lot to help change that.
Yeah, right on. Final thoughts?
Got to keep it short, though. The real challenge is to protect the children. So right now, we introduce technology far too early. The science, you guys must study this science very closely. No screens before age 2, no screens in classes until at least age 12. We're still going the wrong way on those issues. We allow Google to give away Chromebooks to little kids to get them addicted to YouTube early. We have issues with products like Instagram relative to body shaming of preteen girls, fear of missing out and bullying with teens of all types. So my point to you is, let's focus on the kids. If you have no interest in politics, if you have no interest in other things, the same technology is killing our children. It's caused them to lose the ability to have human interconnection because it's substituting phony technology markers for real human interaction, and that's a terrible mistake. Anyway, thank you very much. It's an honor to be here.
Thank you, guys. Please join me in thanking these guys.